The morning sunlight slipped through the curtains, filling the kitchen with a warm golden glow. Emma Williams stood by the stove, flipping pancakes, her favorite Sunday ritual. The scent of butter and brewed coffee filled the room, and for a moment, everything looked peaceful. She wanted this morning to be different, calm, and full of love. Her daughter Chloe had come home from college for the weekend. Her son Ethan was still half asleep upstairs, and her husband David was reading the newspaper in the dining room like always. Emma hummed softly as she laid the table 4 plates, syrup, fresh fruit, and a big pot of coffee. She took extra care arranging everything neatly. She had learned that sometimes beauty in small things could hide the cracks in bigger ones. It was her way of pretending everything was fine. David used to adore these mornings. When they were younger, he'd hug her from behind, joke about stealing her pancakes, and whisper about their dreams. But those days had faded. He had grown distant, first tired, then irritable, and finally cruel in small, invisible ways. His words cut deeper than any knife, and his silence hurt even more. Emma didn't know when love turned into duty, and duty turned into fear. Still, she kept serving, kept smiling, kept believing maybe one day he'd come back to her. Maybe he'd see her again. When everyone gathered at the table, Emma's heart fluttered with quiet hope. Chloe talked excitedly about her classes, showing her grandmother Grace photos from her phone. Ethan mumbled about a project, barely awake but present. Emma watched her family with soft eyes, telling herself that peace had returned, if only for a moment. She poured coffee into David's mug, careful not to spill, and placed it in front of him. He didn't look up, just kept flipping through his newspaper. "Would you like more?" she asked, her voice light but uncertain. He lifted his mug slightly without a word. She took that as a yes and refilled it. For a few seconds, the only sounds were the clinking of forks and the ticking clock. Then David lowered his newspaper and frowned. "The coffee," he said flatly. Emma blinked, confused. "What about it?" He stared at her, irritation flashing in his eyes. "It's cold." She looked at him apologetically. "Oh, I'm sorry, it must have cooled down a bit." "I'll make a fresh," he cut her off sharply. "You've been making coffee every day for 20 years, Emma. How hard is it to keep it hot?" His tone was like a slap. The table went quiet. Chloe froze mid-sentence. Ethan looked up. Grace set down her cup gently, her face tense. Emma swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "I'll make a new pot," she said quickly, standing up. "Don't bother," David said, his voice low but full of anger. Then, before anyone could react, he lifted his mug and threw the coffee straight at her. The hot liquid splashed across her cheek, her neck, her blouse. The sting made her flinch, but what burned more was the humiliation. The mug hit the floor with a sharp crack, spilling coffee across the tiles. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Emma stood there trembling, her breath shallow, her heart racing. She couldn't process what had just happened. The man she had built her life around, raised children with, cooked for, loved, had just thrown coffee at her like she was nothing. Chloe's eyes widened in shock. "Dad," she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. Grace gasped, standing up from her chair. "David, have you lost your mind?" Ethan sat still, pale, eyes darting between his parents. David didn't look ashamed, he looked annoyed. "Maybe next time she'll pay attention," he muttered coldly. Emma's hands shook as she reached for a napkin. Her throat tightened as she dabbed at the dripping coffee on her blouse. Her skin burned, but not from the heat, from the eyes watching her, from the silence that screamed louder than any words. "It's fine," she whispered, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine." Chloe rose from her chair, tears gathering in her eyes. "Mom, you're not fine." Emma looked at her daughter, those kind eyes, so full of love and pain, and something inside her broke. For years, she had kept quiet, thinking silence was strength, that patience would fix everything. But now her silence had become her prison. David stood, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. "I'm done with this nonsense," he said. He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair. No apology, no regret. Just cold emptiness. As he walked toward the door, Chloe shouted after him, "You can't just walk away after that." You hurt her. He didn't turn back. The door slammed, and the sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. For a long moment, no one moved. Emma sank slowly into her chair, her face pale, her hands still trembling. Grace went to her side, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "My dear," she whispered gently, "love should never burn you." Those words hit harder than the coffee. Emma finally let the tears fall. Years of quiet pain came rushing out in soft, broken sobs. Chloe knelt beside her, wrapping her arms tightly around her mother. "Mom, I won't let him hurt you again," she whispered fiercely. "Not ever again." Emma pressed her forehead against Chloe's, her tears mixing with her daughter's. The smell of spilled coffee filled the room, bitter and sharp, the scent of something ending. Ethan looked away, fighting tears of his own. Grace stroked Emma's back, her eyes glistening with a mother's sorrow. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of a world that went on even when hearts broke inside the quiet walls of a home. That night, when the house grew still and everyone had gone to their rooms, Emma sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the stain on the floor where the coffee had spilled. It had dried into a dark mark, one she couldn't quite scrub away. She touched it gently, thinking about how much she had scrubbed over the years, stains on clothes, stains on memories, stains on her heart. She had always managed to clean everything, to make everything seem fine. But not this time. This stain felt permanent. She heard soft footsteps. Chloe walked in, wearing her pajamas, her eyes tired but determined. "Mom," she said quietly, "we need to talk." Emma smiled weakly. "It's late, sweetheart. Go to bed." Chloe shook her head. "No, Mom. I need to say this." She sat across from her mother, her voice trembling but strong. "What happened today? It's not your fault. None of it is. You've done everything to keep this family together, but you can't do it alone. You can't keep letting him treat you like this." Emma's lips quivered. "He was just angry." "Maybe," Chloe interrupted gently. "No, Mom. He wasn't angry. He was cruel. And you don't deserve cruel." Tears filled Emma's eyes again. "Chloe, I just wanted peace. I wanted my family together." Chloe reached across the table, taking her mother's hand. "Maybe peace isn't staying silent, Mom. Maybe peace starts when you stop letting people hurt you." Those words hit deep. For years, Emma had believed silence was her strength, but now, looking into her daughter's eyes, she realized silence had been her cage. The girl she had raised, the one she had taught kindness and patience, was now teaching her courage. Emma exhaled shakily. "I don't even know who I am without him," she whispered. Chloe squeezed her hand. "You're my mother," she said softly. "You're the woman who raised us, who sacrificed everything, who never gave up. You're enough, Mom. You always have been." Emma looked at her daughter, and for the first time in years, she felt something shift, a flicker of strength buried deep inside her chest. It was small, fragile, but real. Upstairs, the house creaked softly as the night deepened. The stain on the floor caught the moonlight from the window, and Emma stared at it one last time. Then she stood up, walked to the sink, and began to clean, not the stain, but the counter, the table, everything around her. Chloe watched quietly, knowing her mother wasn't cleaning to hide the pain this time. She was cleaning to start again. When Emma turned, her eyes still red from crying, there was a quiet resolve in them, a calm she hadn't felt in years. She touched Chloe's face gently and whispered, "Thank you, my love." Chloe smiled through her tears. "For what?" Emma's voice was soft. "For reminding me who I am." Outside, the first light of dawn began to break, pale and new. Emma stood by the window, feeling it touch her face. It was the same light that had filled the room that morning, but somehow it felt different now. It wasn't just sunlight. It was a beginning. The next morning began with silence, the kind that presses against the walls and fills every corner of the house. Emma stood by the window, staring at the old oak tree outside, its bare branches trembling in the soft wind. She hadn't slept at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw David's face, cold, unfeeling, and distant. The sting of the coffee was gone from her skin, but the sting in her heart lingered like a shadow. Downstairs, she could hear Chloe in the kitchen, trying to keep busy, her movements quiet but heavy. Grace had already left early for church. She always did on Mondays, praying for the peace the family seemed to have forgotten. When Emma finally went downstairs, Chloe looked up immediately. "Good morning," she said softly, her eyes searching her mother's face for signs of pain. Emma tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Did you sleep?" Chloe asked. A little, Emma lied. She sat at the table, hands folded in her lap. The chair across from her, David's chair, was empty. He hadn't come home the night before. For a moment, that absence brought relief, but it was quickly replaced by guilt. After 25 years of marriage, she still couldn't bring herself to wish him gone. She had loved him once, fiercely, foolishly, completely. And now she couldn't tell if that love had died or simply turned into something unrecognizable. Around mid-morning, the sound of the front door unlocking made both women tense. David stepped inside, wearing the same clothes as yesterday, the smell of stale coffee and cheap cologne clinging to him. His hair was messy, his eyes bloodshot. Emma's heart tightened. Chloe froze. He looked at them briefly and muttered, "Didn't expect an audience." Emma stood slowly. "David, we need to talk." He scoffed, dropping his keys onto the table. "About what?" "The coffee." His tone was mocking, but underneath it, there was a flicker of unease. "About yesterday," Emma said quietly. "You hurt me." Her voice didn't rise. It was calm, fragile, but steady enough to make him stop and look at her properly. "It was an accident," he said quickly. "You know I didn't mean to." Chloe stepped forward before her mother could reply. "No, Dad. It wasn't an accident. You threw it at her. You did it on purpose." Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't flinch. David turned toward his daughter, irritation flashing across his face. "Watch your tone, young lady. This is between your mother and me." Chloe didn't back down. "No, it's not just between you two. You did it in front of all of us. You humiliated her in front of your family. So don't act like it's private now." The words cut through the air like glass. For a long second, no one spoke. Emma looked at Chloe, torn between pride and fear. David's jaw clenched. "You think you know everything, don't you?" he said, his voice rising. "You're just a kid, Chloe. You don't understand what marriage is." Chloe took a step closer. "If marriage means hurting the person who's always been there for you, then maybe I don't want to understand." David's face darkened. "You've been at that college too long," he muttered. "You think life's all about feelings and drama. You don't know what pressure is." He turned to Emma, his tone growing defensive. "Do you have any idea what it's like to carry this family for years? To work myself sick so everyone else can live comfortably?" Emma's lips parted, her voice trembling. "I've carried it too, David. Maybe not with money, but with everything else, the cooking, the cleaning, the worry, the care. I've given everything I have." He laughed bitterly. "Care? You call this care? The house is a mess, the bills pile up, and you sit around crying over cold coffee." That broke something in Chloe. "Don't you dare talk to her like that," she shouted. The tremor in her voice turned into fire. "She's done everything for you, everything, and you've treated her like she's invisible. You don't even see her anymore." David looked stunned, not by her words, but by the truth in them. For a moment, his anger faltered. "Chloe," he said, his voice softer. But Chloe didn't let him continue. "Do you even remember her birthday last year? Or the year before that? Do you remember the last time you said you loved her without rolling your eyes?" Her voice cracked. "Because I don't." Emma stood silently, tears forming in her eyes, not because of the pain, but because her daughter was saying all the things she'd never had the courage to say. David ran a hand over his face, his expression shifting from anger to exhaustion. "I've been under pressure," he murmured. "Work's been hard." "I didn't mean to," Chloe cut in sharply. "Stop using that as an excuse. We all have stress. But you don't throw coffee at the people you love. You don't break them just because you're broken." The room went still again. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. David sank into a chair, his head in his hands. For the first time in years, he looked small, tired, almost lost. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he said quietly. I don't know what's wrong with me anymore." Emma watched him, her hands twisting together. She wanted to believe him, wanted to find the man she once knew beneath the bitterness. But belief came with a price she wasn't sure she could pay again. Chloe knelt beside her father, her voice soft now. Then fix it, Dad. Don't just say you're sorry. Be sorry. Do something. He looked up, his eyes glistening with something close to guilt. You think it's that easy? Chloe shook her head. No, it's not easy. But it's the only way you'll ever have this family again. Ethan appeared at the doorway then, having overheard the argument. His face was pale, his voice shaky. Dad, he said quietly, I saw what you did yesterday. I didn't say anything because I was scared. But I can't stay quiet anymore. David turned toward him, his lips parting in disbelief. Ethan continued, Mom's the reason we're still a family. You're the one tearing it apart. His voice wavered. I used to look up to you. I used to think you were the strongest man I knew. But yesterday, I saw you become someone I don't recognize. David's eyes fell to the floor. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken pain. Emma felt her knees weaken, and she sat down slowly, tears streaming freely now. All I ever wanted was for us to be happy, she whispered. I didn't care about money or big houses or cars. I just wanted love, laughter, family. Her voice broke. And somewhere along the way, we lost it. David rubbed his temples, his voice barely audible. I don't know when I became this man. Emma looked at him, the man she'd once trusted with her whole heart, and for the first time, she didn't see her husband. She saw a stranger who had forgotten how to love. Chloe stood behind her mother, resting a hand on her shoulder. Maybe it's time you both remember who you were, she said softly. The day passed slowly after that. No more shouting, no more coffee, just quiet reflection. David stayed home, moving through the house like a ghost. Emma cleaned the kitchen again, not because it was dirty, but because she needed to do something with her hands. The stain from yesterday was gone now, but the memory lingered, a dark spot in her heart that no soap could wash away. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls in soft gold, Chloe sat beside her mother on the couch. You did the right thing today, she whispered. Emma smiled faintly. I didn't do anything. Chloe shook her head. You stood your ground, Mom. That's everything. Emma looked at her daughter, the firelight reflecting in those kind eyes, and realized that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it just whispered no more. When night came, David approached her quietly. Emma, he said, his voice unsure. Can we talk? She nodded, but didn't rise. He sat across from her, his hands trembling slightly. I'm sorry, he began. I don't expect forgiveness, but I am sorry. I've been angry for so long I don't even remember why. Maybe at myself. Maybe at life. But you didn't deserve any of it. Emma listened, silent. Her heart wanted to believe him, but her mind held back. I don't know what comes next, David, she said gently. But I can't keep living in fear of your temper. I won't. He nodded slowly, his eyes red. I understand. There was a long pause. Then she said softly, maybe we both need to find ourselves again, separately if we have to. As David left the room, Emma looked toward the window, where the moonlight fell across the floor, soft and forgiving. Chloe joined her, leaning her head on her mother's shoulder. You were brave today, she whispered. Emma smiled faintly. No, sweetheart. You were. And for the first time in a long time, Emma felt a tiny spark of peace, fragile, flickering, but real. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something she hadn't felt in years, the courage to start over. That night stretched endlessly, heavy with thoughts Emma couldn't silence. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of wood and the faint hum of wind outside. She sat on the couch long after everyone had gone to bed, staring at the empty coffee cup on the table, the same one she had used that morning. It was strange, she thought, how an ordinary thing could carry so much meaning after pain. The cup was just porcelain, but in her mind it held everything: the anger, the shame, the years of trying to hold a family together with trembling hands. She ran her fingers over the rim, her eyes unfocused. Somewhere deep inside, something was shifting, a quiet, painful awakening that she had been asleep for too long, living for others, forgetting herself. The realization was heavy, but it was also freeing. The next morning, she rose early. The first light of dawn touched the curtains as she walked into the kitchen, barefoot and thoughtful. The kitchen smelled faintly of yesterday's memories, but she didn't feel anger anymore. Only exhaustion and an odd sort of calm. She brewed a small pot of coffee, just for herself this time, and carried it to the porch. The air was cool, the kind that wakes you gently. She sat down, wrapped her robe tighter, and looked at the yard, the same yard where she and David had planted flowers together years ago. They had laughed so much back then. David had teased her about planting too many daisies, and she had joked that daisies were like her, simple, but they kept coming back no matter how many storms tried to kill them. Now the flowers were gone, only dry stems left, but she smiled faintly, because she understood them better now. Maybe she had been a daisy all along, quiet, persistent, surviving even when no one noticed her growing. David came downstairs a few hours later. His steps were slower than usual, his face drawn and tired. He hesitated at the door, watching her from a distance. For once, he didn't have that defensive look, the armor of pride he always wore. Instead, he looked unsure, like a man who'd woken up in a life he no longer recognized. "Morning," he said quietly. Emma didn't turn right away. She took a sip of her coffee and finally replied, "Morning." He cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "I didn't sleep much." She nodded. "Me neither." The silence between them was no longer the sharp kind that cut. It was the soft kind that held too much history. David sat down on the step beside her, careful to leave space between them. For a moment, they just sat there, listening to the sound of birds. Then he said, "I don't know when we became like this." Emma didn't answer immediately. She stared at the yard, at the sun slowly rising over the fence. "I do," she said softly. "It happened so slowly we didn't even notice. We stopped talking. We stopped laughing. We started surviving instead of living." David lowered his head. "I kept telling myself I was working for us, that all those long hours meant something. But when I came home, I was too tired to even see you." His voice cracked a little. "And then I started blaming you for my own emptiness." Emma's eyes softened, but she said nothing. Sometimes silence said more than words ever could. After a moment, David continued, "I thought I was the only one struggling. But you were carrying everything I didn't want to face." He looked at her then, really looked, maybe for the first time in years. The lines around her eyes, the faint silver in her hair, he saw not the woman he blamed, but the woman who had quietly held their world together. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just wanted you to know that I see it now." Emma nodded slowly. "Seeing it is a start," she said gently. "But forgiveness isn't a gift you ask for, it's something you earn." Chloe came out then, still in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. When she saw them sitting together, she hesitated, unsure if she should interrupt. "Come here, honey," Emma said softly. Chloe sat between them, and the three of them just watched the morning unfold. It wasn't peaceful, not yet, but it was quiet, and that quiet held possibility. After a while, David stood. "I'm going to head to the office," he said. Emma nodded. "All right." He hesitated, then added, "I'll be home for dinner." She gave a faint smile. "We'll see." He left without saying more, but there was something different in the way he closed the door, not anger, not distance, just thoughtfulness. Later that day, Emma found herself cleaning again, but not like before. This time, she cleaned to think, to breathe. Every dish she washed felt like a small act of reclaiming herself. She turned on some old music, the kind she used to dance to while cooking when the kids were little. For the first time in years, she let herself hum along. Chloe peeked in from the hallway, smiling softly. "You're singing again," she said. Emma laughed quietly. "Maybe I am." It felt strange and familiar all at once. By afternoon, she decided to walk into town. It had been ages since she'd done anything just for herself. She put on a simple dress, tied her hair, and grabbed her purse. The world outside felt different, brighter, even though it hadn't changed. She stopped by the small cafe she and David used to visit when they were newly married. The owner, Mrs. Lawson, still remembered her. "Emma Williams," she exclaimed warmly. I haven't seen you in forever. How are you? Emma hesitated, then smiled. Better, I think. Mrs. Lawson nodded knowingly. Good. You always had a light in you, dear. Don't let anyone dim it. The words lingered in Emma's heart like a quiet blessing. She ordered a cup of coffee, hot, strong, the way she liked it, and sat by the window, watching people pass. Young couples laughing, children running, old friends talking. Life moving, flowing, healing. She thought about how much she had lost and how much she still had. Her daughter, her son, her mother's love, and now, perhaps, a second chance at herself. For the first time, she didn't feel trapped. She felt present. She felt alive. Back at home, Chloe was on the phone with Ethan, who had gone back to campus. Mom's doing better, Chloe said, smiling as she looked out the window. You should have seen her this morning. She actually laughed. Ethan chuckled. Good. She deserves it. Tell her I love her, okay? Chloe nodded, her eyes soft. I will. When she hung up, she noticed her father's car pulling into the driveway. She tensed slightly, but didn't move. David stepped out, holding a small brown paper bag. He looked nervous. Emma met him at the door. What's that? She asked. He cleared his throat. Dinner. I thought maybe I could bring something home for once. She raised an eyebrow, surprised. You? Takeout? He smiled, faintly embarrassed. Don't get used to it. The woman at the restaurant talked me into the most expensive lasagna they had. She couldn't help but laugh quietly. That woman has good taste. They ate together, all three of them, and though it was awkward, it wasn't hostile. There were pauses, small smiles, even a few quiet jokes. David seemed softer, almost careful with his words. When he asked Chloe about school, she actually answered without sarcasm. For a brief moment, it felt like the old days. But Emma knew it would take time, real time, for anything to heal. After dinner, as Chloe went upstairs, David stayed behind. Emma, he said quietly, I don't know what comes next, but I'd like to try. She looked at him for a long moment, studying his face, the tired lines, the regret. Trying is a start, she said simply. But don't do it for me. Do it because you want to be better. He nodded, his voice rough. I do. That night, after he'd gone to bed, Emma sat at her vanity and looked at her reflection. For the first time in years, she didn't see just a wife or a mother. She saw Emma, the woman who used to dream of teaching art, who loved the smell of rain, who once believed life could be beautiful even after heartbreak. She smiled softly at the woman in the mirror. You're still here, she whispered. You made it. Then she picked up her old sketchbook from the drawer, its pages yellowed and edges worn. She hadn't opened it in over a decade. Inside were drawings of flowers, faces, and small moments she'd once loved. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up a pencil and began to draw again, lines shaky at first, then stronger. The sound of the pencil against paper was like a heartbeat returning to rhythm. Outside, the moon rose high, silver light spilling through the curtains. Emma worked quietly, feeling something she hadn't in years, peace. Down the hall, David stirred in his sleep, dreaming of old memories and unspoken apologies. Somewhere deep inside, he knew the road to forgiveness would be long. But for the first time, he wanted to walk it. And as the night deepened, Emma continued sketching, the faintest smile on her lips, the shadows of the past slowly fading into the background of a new beginning she was finally ready to claim. The following days passed quietly, like the gentle aftermath of a storm. Emma found herself waking up early again, not out of duty, but because her mind was alive with thoughts. Every morning she sat by the window with her sketchbook, the sun spilling across her pages as she drew faces, flowers, memories that once hurt but now felt like they were fading into forgiveness. Her pencil seemed to understand her heart better than words ever could. She drew Chloe's smile, the one that always carried both strength and softness. She drew Ethan's curious eyes. She even sketched David's old laugh, the one he hadn't used in years, but that still echoed somewhere in her memory. Sometimes she cried quietly while drawing, not from sadness anymore, but from release. After years of holding in pain, The tears finally felt cleansing. Chloe noticed the change in her mother first, the lightness in her step, the warmth returning to her voice. One afternoon, she peeked into Emma's art room and froze when she saw the sketches scattered across the table. "Mom," she whispered, eyes wide, "these are beautiful." Emma turned, smiling softly. "They're just old habits coming back." Chloe shook her head. "No, Mom. This is you. This is who you've always been." She hugged her tightly, and for the first time in a long while, Emma allowed herself to melt into the embrace, realizing how much she'd missed just being held. Meanwhile, David had begun to notice the quiet changes in his wife too, the calm confidence in her tone, the way she carried herself differently, as if she no longer lived in the shadow of his moods. It unsettled him at first, then humbled him. At work, he found himself distracted, thinking about her more than the endless reports on his desk. The image of that morning, the coffee, the shock on her face, haunted him in flashes, making him sick with guilt. He began leaving the office earlier, sometimes buying flowers on the way home, though he rarely had the courage to hand them to her directly. Instead, he would leave them on the kitchen counter with no note, and Emma never said anything, but she always placed them in a vase by the window. There was no spoken forgiveness yet, just small gestures floating between them like fragile bridges being built from both sides. One evening, he walked into the living room and found her humming while sketching by the firelight. The sight caught him off guard, her hair glowing gold in the warmth, her hands steady, her expression peaceful. He hadn't seen that look on her face since their early years of marriage. "You're drawing again," he said quietly. She didn't look up, just smiled faintly. "I guess I never really stopped. I just forgot who I was." He nodded slowly, guilt tightening in his chest. "I think I forgot too." Later that week, Chloe came home with a small envelope. "Mom," she said, handing it over, "they're hosting a local art exhibition downtown. You should join." Emma laughed softly, shaking her head. "Oh, sweetheart, I haven't done anything like that in decades." Chloe grinned. "Exactly. It's time." For days, Emma debated it. The thought of showing her art to strangers terrified her, but something in Chloe's faith gave her courage. One afternoon, she carefully packed a few of her sketches into a folder and went to register. The small gallery smelled of fresh paint and coffee, and the walls were covered with local artists' work, every piece telling a story of struggle, healing, or hope. When she gave her name to the woman at the desk, the lady smiled warmly. "Emma Williams," she read aloud. "You're on the list now. Welcome back." The phrase lingered in Emma's mind the entire walk home. Welcome back. It felt like the universe had just whispered, "I've been waiting for you." When she returned home, David was sitting on the porch, his tie loosened, eyes tired. "Long day?" she asked. He nodded. "You could say that." She sat beside him, the setting sun painting the sky orange. For a while, they didn't speak. Then she said softly, "I'm joining an art show." He turned to her, surprised but proud. "You're serious?" She nodded. "Yes. It's time I do something for me." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting something close to admiration. "You should. You've always had a gift." There was sincerity in his voice that made her chest ache. It reminded her of the man she fell in love with before the walls went up, before bitterness took over. For a fleeting moment, they were just Emma and David again, two people who once dreamed together under the same sky. Chloe, ever watchful, saw her parents beginning to find fragments of peace, but she also knew the wound beneath was still raw. That night, she called her brother Ethan and said, "They're talking again." "It's small, but it's happening." Ethan chuckled. "Mom always believed in small beginnings." Chloe smiled. "Yeah, but I think this time, she's doing it for herself." And that was true. For years, Emma's love had been about keeping everyone else from falling apart. Now it was about putting herself back together, piece by piece, brushstroke by brushstroke. When the day of the art show arrived, Emma stood in front of the mirror wearing a simple navy blue dress, her hair neatly pinned. She stared at her reflection, almost not recognizing the woman who looked back. Not because she looked younger or different, but because she looked alive. David appeared at the door, hesitating. "You look beautiful," he said softly. She turned, smiling faintly. "Thank you." Chloe came running down the stairs, excitement in her eyes. "Mom, let's go before we're late." They drove together in quiet anticipation. At the gallery, as people moved from one art piece to another, Emma stood near her corner, her sketches displayed gently under warm light. Each piece told a story, not of perfection, but of endurance, heartbreak, and rediscovery. People stopped to look, some even teary-eyed. One woman touched Emma's arm and said, "Your work feels like it's breathing." Emma smiled. "Maybe because it finally can." From across the room, David watched her, the way she stood, calm and confident, surrounded by quiet admiration. It struck him then how much he had taken her light for granted, how long she'd been dimmed by his own unhappiness. His chest tightened, not from regret alone but from awe. When she glanced at him and their eyes met, he mouthed the words, "I'm proud of you." And for the first time since that terrible morning, Emma believed he meant it. That night, as they drove home under the silver glow of the moon, Chloe leaned her head on her mother's shoulder and whispered, "You did it, Mom." Emma smiled softly, her heart warm. "No, sweetheart," she said. "We did it, all of us. We started over." But deep down, she knew something had changed forever, not the past, but the way it lived inside her. The pain no longer controlled her, it had become part of her strength. And as she looked out the window at the endless road ahead, she whispered a silent promise to herself, "Never again will I let anyone make me forget who I am." The week after the art show, something subtle yet powerful shifted in the Williams household. The silence that once felt heavy now carried peace, and the air no longer trembled with unspoken anger, but with quiet understanding. Emma's art had become a daily rhythm. Every morning, she painted before the rest of the house woke up, each brushstroke like a prayer, each color a piece of her rebirth. Chloe loved watching her mother come alive, her hands stained with paint, her eyes shining with purpose. One evening, while Emma was cleaning her brushes, Chloe said softly, "You know, Mom, when you paint, it's like the whole house breathes again." Emma smiled, touched, her heart swelling with both pride and humility. "Maybe it's because I finally learned how to breathe myself," she replied gently. But as light filled Emma's life again, shadows of guilt still lingered behind David's eyes. He had been quieter lately, kinder, more careful, yet Emma could feel the weight he carried. One night, he came home early from work and found her painting a portrait of a woman standing alone in the rain. The woman looked fragile, but her eyes were fierce, her head held high. "That's you," he said softly, almost in awe. Emma looked at the painting, then at him. "It's who I used to be," she answered. "And who I'm still becoming." David nodded, his throat tightening. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." She didn't reply, but the silence between them was no longer cold, it was tender, a fragile truce built on truth. The following weekend, Chloe invited her grandmother, Grace, over for dinner. The moment Grace walked in, her sharp eyes took in the warmth of the house, the laughter, the smell of roasted herbs, the faint sound of soft jazz playing in the background. "Something's different here," she said with a knowing smile. "It smells like peace." Emma laughed softly. "Maybe a little bit of healing, too." Grace hugged her tightly. "You've always had it in you, sweetheart. You just needed to remember." During dinner, stories and laughter flowed easily. Grace told tales of her youth. Chloe rolled her eyes playfully at her grandmother's dramatic flair, and even David chuckled, a sound that felt almost new. But when Grace looked at him, her eyes softened. "You've made mistakes, David," she said calmly, her voice neither harsh nor forgiving, "but you still have time to be the man this family deserves. Don't waste it." David lowered his head, shame coloring his face. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm trying." Grace nodded, satisfied with the honesty in his tone. "Good. Trying means your heart still remembers what love is." The conversation moved on, but the words stayed with him long after the dishes were cleared. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, David sat alone in the living room, staring at the family photos on the mantel. Pictures of birthdays, vacations, and laughter long gone. He realized how many years he'd spent chasing success while neglecting the people who were his real success all along. He thought about the day he threw the coffee, the horror in Emma's eyes, Chloe's trembling voice. That moment replayed like a wound that refused to close. Finally, he stood, went to the study, and began writing a letter. He poured everything he'd buried inside, the regret, the love, the apologies that words had failed to carry before. Emma, he wrote, I know sorry will never erase what I did, but I need you to know that I see you now. I see the woman who stayed when she had every reason to walk away. I see the strength I once called weakness. And I see how deeply I hurt you by forgetting the kind of love you deserved. I don't expect forgiveness. I only want you to know that I am still the man who fell in love with you, and I want to be worthy of that love again. He folded the letter carefully, placed it on her nightstand, and went to sleep, his heart heavy but lighter than it had been in years. When Emma woke the next morning and found the letter, she hesitated before opening it. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. Reading his words, tears welled in her eyes, not out of sadness, but from the strange relief of finally being seen. For years she had screamed in silence, hoping he would notice her pain, and now, though late, he had. She pressed the letter to her chest, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Thank you." She didn't run to him or call his name. Instead, she went to her easel, took a deep breath, and began to paint again, this time not from pain, but from gratitude. When David came downstairs, she handed him a cup of coffee, the same gesture that had once started their downfall. "Peace?" she asked softly. He nodded, his eyes glistening. Peace. For the first time, they drank their morning coffee together in silence that felt healing, not empty. Days turned into weeks, and Emma's art continued to gain attention. Her story spread quietly through the town, the woman who turned pain into beauty, who rediscovered herself through art. A local magazine featured her with the headline, "From Broken to Brave." The article reached farther than she expected. People began writing her letters, sharing how her story gave them courage to leave toxic relationships, to chase dreams they had buried under duty. Emma read every letter with tears of empathy and awe. She never imagined her quiet recovery could touch strangers' hearts. But it was Chloe's reaction that moved her most. One evening, Chloe handed her a small gift, a leather-bound journal. "What's this?" Emma asked, smiling. "A new beginning," Chloe said softly. "Write your story, Mom. The world needs to hear it." Emma opened the journal, the blank pages gleaming with promise. She looked at her daughter, her greatest masterpiece, and whispered, "Maybe it's time." That night, as the family gathered for dinner, David raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said quietly. Emma met his eyes and lifted her glass too. "To honesty," she added. Chloe smiled, her eyes shimmering. "And to strong women who never give up." They laughed softly, a sound that filled the room with warmth. For the first time in years, the Williams family wasn't pretending to be perfect. They were just real, flawed, healing, and together. As the candles flickered and the night deepened, Emma looked around the table and thought about how far they had come. There were still wounds, still scars, but also light, the kind that came from surviving the storm and still choosing love. In her heart, she whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, not just for forgiveness, but for the strength it took to rebuild what was once broken. Weeks turned into months, and Emma's life slowly took on a new rhythm, one built not on obligation, but on quiet purpose. Her mornings began with painting, her afternoons with letters from strangers who had found courage through her story, and her evenings with soft laughter shared around the dinner table. Yet, as peace returned to her home, life had a way of reminding her that healing wasn't just hers to carry, it was something her children needed too. One rainy evening, as thunder rolled softly outside, Chloe came home with eyes red and swollen. Emma looked up from her sketchbook immediately, worry tightening her chest. "Sweetheart, what happened?" Chloe dropped her bag on the floor and fell into her mother's arms, sobbing. "He left me, Mom." Just like that. No reason, no goodbye. Emma held her tightly, stroking her hair, feeling her daughter's heart break in her hands the way hers once had. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice steady though her heart ached. "You'll breathe again, I promise." Chloe looked up, tears streaking her face. "How do you know?" Emma smiled sadly. "Because I did." They sat there for a long time, the storm outside echoing the one in their hearts, until finally Chloe fell asleep in her mother's lap, her breathing soft and even. Emma brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face and whispered, "You're stronger than you think." Later that night, Emma found David sitting by the window, staring into the dark yard. He had heard everything. "She's hurting," he said quietly. Emma nodded, folding her arms. "Heartbreak is a cruel teacher." David turned toward her, his face full of regret. "I see her pain, and I see yours in it too. What I did to you, Emma? I don't know how you ever found it in your heart to stay." She met his gaze calmly, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "Because love doesn't mean perfection, David. It means choosing to see the person beyond their mistakes, but it also means learning when to stop breaking yourself for them." He looked down, her words sinking deep into his conscience. "You stayed," he whispered. "But I don't know if I deserve that." Emma exhaled softly. "Maybe you didn't. But I stayed for me, to prove that I could turn pain into something beautiful." She walked closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Now it's your turn to stay. Not because you owe me, but because you finally understand what love costs." The following morning, Emma decided to do something she'd been afraid of for years: share her full story publicly. With Chloe's encouragement, she began posting her journey online, pairing her paintings with short reflections about resilience, forgiveness, and womanhood. Her words were raw but real. "There was a time I believed silence was strength. I learned that true strength is speaking your truth, even when your voice trembles." Her posts spread quickly, reaching thousands of women who saw themselves in her story: wives, mothers, daughters who had lost pieces of themselves to others' tempers and expectations. Comments flooded in, filled with gratitude and tears. One woman wrote, "You've given me hope that it's never too late to start over." Another said, "I left an abusive marriage today because I read your story. Thank you for reminding me I matter." Emma read each message with humility and awe, realizing that her healing had become a mirror in which others could see their own strength. Chloe, watching from her room, smiled proudly. "Mom, you're helping people," she said one night. Emma looked at her with teary eyes. "Maybe we're all just trying to remind each other that broken doesn't mean finished." But as Emma's story grew, David felt something inside him stir, not jealousy, but reflection. He saw the woman he had once silenced now standing as a voice for thousands. It filled him with both admiration and a deep, aching guilt. He began volunteering at a local men's support group, a place where husbands and fathers learned to unlearn anger, pride, and the walls they'd built around emotion. He didn't tell Emma at first, afraid she might think it was too little, too late. But one evening, when she noticed he was coming home later than usual, she asked, "Where have you been going?" He hesitated, then told her the truth. "A men's group," he said quietly. "I needed to understand why I became the man who hurt the people I loved." Emma stared at him for a long moment, her eyes soft with disbelief and something close to pride. "That's brave," she said finally. He shook his head. "No, Emma. You're the brave one. I'm just trying to follow your lead." For the first time, she saw a genuine humility in him that she had once thought impossible. A few weeks later, Chloe began journaling too. Her heartbreak had left her hollow at first, but watching her mother transform pain into purpose gave her a kind of strength she didn't know she had. "Maybe healing runs in the family," she joked one night, and Emma laughed softly, her eyes glistening. "Maybe it does." They spent hours together writing, painting, and talking about life, not as mother and daughter, but as two women who understood the beauty of surviving. One afternoon, Chloe asked, "Mom, do you ever regret staying with Dad after everything?" Emma paused, her brush hovering over the canvas. "No," she said softly. "Because staying taught me who I was, and forgiving him set me free. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing peace over poison." Chloe nodded, her heart full of admiration. Spring arrived soon after, and with it came invitations for Emma to speak at local women's events. The first time she stood before a small crowd, her hands trembled slightly, but when she looked out and saw faces of women who understood her pain, the fear melted away. "We are not what was done to us," she said, her voice firm but kind. "We are what we choose to become after." The applause that followed wasn't loud, it was tender, grateful, real. David sat in the back, his eyes moist, his hands clasped. For the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider in her story. He felt like a man finally learning how to be worthy of the woman he loved. That night, as they walked home under the stars, Emma slipped her arm through his. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes pain is what wakes us up to what really matters." He nodded, his voice low. "And sometimes love is what teaches us how to live after the pain." She smiled, resting her head lightly on his shoulder. They walked in silence for a long time, not as a broken couple trying to fix the past, but as two souls walking side by side, humbled by everything they had survived. When they reached home, Chloe was waiting at the door, a small smile on her face. "You both look happy," she said. Emma glanced at David and whispered, "We're getting there." By summer, Emma's story had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. What started as simple posts about her healing journey had now reached people far beyond her small town. Messages poured in from women across the country, teachers, mothers, widows, and even grandmothers, each one saying how her words had helped them find courage again. One morning, as she sat on the porch with her coffee and sketchbook, her phone buzzed with a message that made her pause. It was from a producer of a popular talk show in New York, inviting her to share her story on national television. For a long moment, Emma just stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure she was ready to open her life that widely, but when she looked up and saw Chloe watching her from the doorway with a proud smile, she realized something important. Her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to every woman who had ever felt small and voiceless. That night at dinner, she told the family about the invitation. David's fork froze midair, surprise flickering across his face. "National TV," he repeated softly. "Emma, that's huge." She nodded, nervous but calm. "I don't know if I should do it," she admitted. "It's one thing to pain about pain, but to talk about it in front of millions." Chloe interrupted gently, "Mom, you've already done the hard part. You lived it. Now you just have to tell the truth." Over the next few days, the idea lingered in Emma's mind like a melody she couldn't forget. She thought about the years she spent silent, enduring humiliation and heartbreak in the name of keeping peace, and how that silence had almost erased her spirit. Maybe telling her story wasn't about fame or recognition. Maybe it was about closing that chapter with dignity. Finally, one afternoon, she looked at David and said, "I'm going to do it." He nodded slowly, though she saw the flicker of fear in his eyes, not for her, but for what the world might think of him once her truth was out. That night, he sat alone in the living room, wrestling with the ghosts of his mistakes. He knew Emma would never lie or exaggerate, but hearing their private shame spoken aloud to strangers terrified him. Still, a quiet voice inside whispered that maybe it was time for him to stop hiding, too. Meanwhile, Chloe's own life was changing. After months of heartbreak and healing, she had applied for a graduate art program in Boston, inspired by her mother's courage. The letter of acceptance arrived on the same day Emma received her official flight itinerary to New York. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. That evening, they sat together on the porch, the sunset washing the world in gold. "So," Emma said softly, "Boston." Chloe smiled, though her eyes were misty. "Yeah, it feels right, but it also feels far." Emma squeezed her hand. "Go where your heart leads you. You were never meant to stay small, Chloe." Chloe blinked back tears. "I get that from you." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the crickets, both feeling the bittersweet pull of change, one chapter closing, another opening. Inside, David watched them through the window, his chest tightening with both pride and longing. He realized that life had given him a second chance not just with his wife, but with his family, and he didn't want to waste it. A week later, the day of Emma's trip arrived. She wore a simple cream blouse and navy slacks, her hair pulled back neatly, her eyes clear but emotional. David insisted on driving her to the airport. The ride was quiet at first, filled with soft music and unspoken thoughts. Halfway there, he reached over and took her hand, not out of habit, but from sincerity. "Emma," he said quietly, "before you go on that show, I need you to know something. You don't have to protect me from the truth. Say whatever you need to say. I deserve to be part of the story, even the ugly parts." She looked at him, her eyes glistening. "That's brave of you." He smiled faintly. "No, it's honest. You taught me that." She squeezed his hand gently, and for a moment, the years of pain between them seemed to dissolve into mutual respect. The show aired 2 days later. The studio lights were bright, the air crisp with anticipation. Emma sat on the couch across from the host, her hands calm on her lap. When the questions began, she spoke softly but clearly, her voice steady with truth. She talked about love, forgiveness, and the long road from humiliation to healing. When the host asked about the morning her husband threw coffee on her, the audience gasped. Emma didn't cry. Instead, she smiled gently. "That was the day I stopped being invisible," she said. "I realized I had spent years trying to fix someone else's anger while ignoring my own pain. But that day, I saw myself, and I chose to never look away again." The studio fell silent for a moment, then erupted in applause. Watching from home, David sat motionless, tears streaming down his face. He had heard those words before, but hearing them in front of the world broke something open inside him, and strangely, it felt like healing. When Emma came home the next day, he met her at the door, holding a bouquet of white daisies, her favorite. "You were incredible," he said quietly. "You told the truth with grace." She smiled softly. "And you faced it with courage." A few days later, an article went viral online, Emma Williams, the woman who painted her pain into power. Her story inspired thousands, but she never let it change her humility. She still cooked dinner, still watered her garden, still painted by the same window every morning. Chloe helped her pack for Boston, both excited and emotional. "I'll call every day," Chloe promised. Emma laughed. "You'll be too busy changing the world." On the morning Chloe left, David hugged his daughter tightly. "Take care of your mom," she whispered playfully. He smiled, his voice thick. "She's been taking care of me for years. It's about time I return the favor." As Chloe's car disappeared down the road, Emma leaned against the doorway, her heart full, not of sadness, but of gratitude. That night, Emma and David sat outside under the stars, the air warm and still. She rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing everything?" He nodded slowly. "Every day. But maybe losing everything was what we needed to find what really mattered." She smiled faintly. "Maybe it was." In the distance, the wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the soft scent of daisies, her daisies, blooming again after all these years. And as she closed her eyes, Emma knew that sometimes life didn't give you the ending you expected, it gave you the one you had the strength to create. Months passed since Emma's television appearance, and life quietly blossomed into something new, not perfect, not without scars, but peaceful in a way she had never known before. Her story had touched millions, but what amazed her most was the quiet ripple it created in the lives of ordinary people. Letters still arrived daily, some handwritten, some typed from women who found courage to forgive, leave, rebuild, or simply breathe again. One letter came from a man named Carl, who wrote, "Your husband's courage to face his mistakes gave me hope that I can change too." Emma read it aloud at breakfast one morning, her voice trembling. David listened silently, then whispered, "Maybe that's what all of this was for, not to be perfect, but to help someone else get a second chance." She looked at him softly, a small smile curving her lips. "Maybe redemption isn't something we earn, David. Maybe it's something we grow into." Chloe, now settled in Boston, called every weekend. Her voice was full of energy again, her laughter returning like sunshine after a long storm. She told stories about her new friends, late-night painting sessions, and how one of her professors admired her raw, emotional honesty. One evening, she shyly mentioned a boy named Ethan, kind, thoughtful, and quiet, who had lost his mother a few years earlier. "He says my art reminds him of her," Chloe said softly. Emma smiled through the phone, feeling a swell of motherly pride. "Then maybe you remind him of hope," she replied. Chloe laughed gently. "You always know the right thing to say, Mom." After they hung up, Emma sat by the window, watching the wind dance through the garden. Her daughter was healing, and that, more than any success, was her greatest peace. Meanwhile, David continued his work at the men's support group. What started as quiet participation had turned into leadership. He was now mentoring other men who struggled with anger, teaching them how to listen, to apologize, to rebuild without shame. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was sacred in its own way. One evening, he came home later than usual, his eyes tired but content. "Rough night?" Emma asked, handing him a cup of tea. He shook his head softly. "No, a meaningful one. A man came up to me tonight and said he stopped yelling at his wife because of something I said last week." Emma's eyes softened. "And what did you say?" He looked down, smiling faintly. "That silence after anger isn't peace, it's damage. Real peace comes when you start choosing kindness, even when it's hard." Emma reached out and touched his hand. "You've come a long way, David." He looked at her with quiet sincerity. "No, Emma. We have." As autumn approached, Emma was invited to speak at a women's retreat in Vermont, a small, intimate gathering surrounded by mountains and golden trees. She hesitated at first, missing Chloe and not wanting to leave David alone for long, but he encouraged her. "Go," he said gently. "You've spent your life taking care of us. Let your story take care of others now." So she went. The retreat was beautiful, women sitting in circles, sharing their stories by the fireplace, tears mixing with laughter. When it was Emma's turn to speak, she stood before them in a simple cream sweater, her voice calm and warm. "Healing isn't a straight line," she said. "Some days you'll bloom, some days you'll break. But even broken branches can grow again if they're given light." When she finished, the room was silent, and then one by one women stood and applauded softly, some wiping tears, some smiling with quiet gratitude. In that moment, Emma realized that her pain had become her purpose and her story. Once her greatest shame was now her greatest gift. Back home, David was preparing a surprise. With the help of some friends from his group, he renovated Emma's old art room, repainting the walls a soft pale blue and hanging frames of her favorite paintings. When she returned, tired but glowing from the trip, he led her inside and said, "You gave the world your story. I thought it was time the world saw your art too." Emma gasped softly, her eyes filling with tears as she looked around the room. Each painting, once hidden in the attic, now hung proudly on the walls, bathed in sunlight. In the center of the room stood an easel with a blank canvas. "A new beginning," David said quietly. Emma turned to him, her voice trembling. "You remembered." He smiled gently. "How could I forget the woman who taught me how to see beauty again?" As winter neared, Chloe came home for the holidays, bringing Ethan with her. He was polite, respectful, and nervous, but he instantly fit into their little world. Over dinner, as snow fell softly outside, the four of them laughed, shared stories, and even played an old board game Emma had kept since Chloe was little. There was warmth in the house again, the kind that comes not from perfection, but from forgiveness. That night, after everyone went to bed, Emma stood by the window, watching the snow settle over the garden. She felt a deep, quiet contentment, a sense that life had come full circle. Pain had become wisdom, shame had become strength, and love, flawed, tested, but true, had become home again. When David joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind, she leaned back into him and whispered, "Do you feel that?" He kissed her hair softly. "What?" "Peace," she said simply. "Real peace." He smiled against her shoulder. "I never thought we'd find it." She turned to him, her eyes shining. "We didn't find it, David. We built it, one apology, one truth, one act of love at a time." And as the snow continued to fall, Emma closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer of gratitude, not for a perfect life, but for a second chance to live it fully. The new year came quietly, bringing with it a kind of golden calm that Emma hadn't felt in decades. Her art studio thrived, her story still traveled through online posts and gatherings, and Chloe's life in Boston bloomed beautifully. Every evening, Emma and David would walk together through their garden, hand in hand, talking about small things: the scent of blooming jasmine, the way the light hit the mountains, the laughter they once thought they'd lost forever. It was a peace both had earned through years of tears, truth, and time. But as winter melted into spring, a shadow began to form, subtle at first, like a whisper of wind in the stillness. Emma had started feeling tired more often, her energy fading sooner than usual. She brushed it off at first, blaming her busy schedule, but one afternoon, while teaching a small art class at the community center, she suddenly grew dizzy and had to sit down. The world spun for a moment, and when she looked up, every face in the room blurred. David rushed her to the hospital that evening, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. The tests came back the next day: anemia, they said, nothing too dangerous, but they wanted to run more scans, just to be sure. The tone of the doctor's voice left David uneasy, though Emma smiled reassuringly. "I'm fine," she insisted. "Don't make that face. I've survived worse." He tried to smile back, but his heart was heavy with unspoken fear. Days turned into weeks, and the tests continued. Chloe flew in from Boston the moment she heard, her eyes red from crying. When she saw her mother in the hospital bed, her voice broke. "Mom, please tell me you're okay." Emma reached out, cupping her daughter's cheek softly. "Sweetheart, I'm okay. My body's just tired, that's all." But later that night, when the room was dark and quiet, she looked out the window at the city lights and whispered a prayer. "God, I've had my share of miracles, but if there's any left, please let me stay a little longer. They still need me." When David came in, carrying a cup of tea, he heard her voice and stopped at the door. He wanted to tell her that he needed her too, more than he ever had, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he sat beside her and took her hand. "Remember when we thought love was about big gestures?" he said quietly. "Now I'd give anything just to hold your hand forever." Emma smiled weakly. "That's because we finally learned what love really is." A few days later, the doctors confirmed it was early-stage leukemia. The room fell silent. David felt the air leave his chest, while Chloe covered her mouth in shock. Emma took a deep breath and said calmly, "Okay. Then we fight." Her strength in that moment stunned them both. "Mom, are you sure?" Chloe whispered. "You don't have to be brave for us." Emma smiled softly. "I'm not being brave, sweetheart. I'm just being me." Treatment began soon after: hospital visits, medications, sleepless nights. Her hair thinned, her skin paled, but her spirit stayed luminous. David never left her side. He learned how to make her favorite soup, sat with her through every infusion, and read her favorite books aloud when she was too tired to talk. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of dawn, he'd hold her hand and whisper, "If I could take your pain, I would." She'd squeeze his hand back gently and say, "You already did years ago, when you became the man I always knew you could be." Those words carried him through the hardest days. Chloe split her time between Boston and home, juggling her studies with hospital visits. Her art grew darker, deeper, full of emotion, but also of light. One day, she showed Emma a painting she had finished, her mother sitting by a window, sunlight spilling over her face, her expression peaceful, her hands covered in paint. "I called it The Woman Who Stayed," Chloe said softly. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "It's beautiful, honey." Chloe smiled faintly. "You taught me that beauty isn't about how something looks, it's about what it survives." Emma reached for her hand, pride shining through her frailty. "Then you've learned everything I ever wanted you to know." As the months passed, Emma's condition wavered, some days better, some worse. Through it all, David stayed by her side, sleeping in a chair beside her hospital bed, refusing to leave even when the nurses insisted. "I wasn't there when she needed me once," he told them softly. "I won't make that mistake again." When Emma finally came home for a short recovery break, the house looked different, brighter, softer, filled with flowers. David had turned the living room into a small sanctuary for her. Candles, music, paintings, everything she loved most. "You did all this?" she asked, her eyes wide. He smiled. "You made this house a home again, Emma. I'm just returning the favor." That night, as they sat together on the couch, watching the fireplace crackle, she leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "If this is the last chapter, then I'm okay with how the story ends, because we finally got it right." He kissed her forehead gently, his voice breaking. "No, Emma. This isn't the end. It's just another beginning." Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the garden in soft white light, the same garden where Emma had once painted her first sunrise after that painful day so many years ago. Through the window, the faint outline of her daisies could still be seen, standing stubbornly against the cold, blooming even in winter. David looked at them, then at Emma, and thought, maybe miracles didn't always come as cures or second chances. Sometimes, they came as forgiveness that lasted a lifetime, as love that learned to grow even in the hardest soil. Spring arrived gently that year, painting the world in soft greens and golds, as if nature itself was trying to remind everyone that life always finds a way to begin again. Emma's health had become fragile, her body weaker, but her spirit shone brighter than ever. The hospital visits had lessened, and most days she stayed home, wrapped in a shawl by the window, painting when her hands allowed it, smiling when she caught the sunlight dancing through the glass. Chloe came home from Boston for good, finishing her classes online, saying she wanted to spend this time where love lives. The three of them, Emma, David, and Chloe, fell into a quiet rhythm, one that revolved around care, laughter, and the simple joys of being together. Every morning, David brought her tea and fresh daisies from the garden, placing them in a small vase beside her bed. "Still my favorite," she'd whisper, inhaling their soft scent. "They're stubborn flowers," he'd say with a smile. "They remind me of you." She'd chuckle, her eyes glistening. "That's why they keep blooming." One afternoon, as the sun spilled through the curtains, Emma asked David to bring her a box from the top of the closet, an old wooden chest she had kept for years. Inside were letters, photographs, and sketches she'd never shown anyone. She spread them out across her lap and began organizing them into neat piles. "What are you doing?" David asked softly. "Finishing my story," she replied. "I want Chloe to have it all, not just the good parts, but the real ones. The love, the pain, the lessons." David sat beside her, his eyes misty. "You've already given her everything, Emma." She smiled gently. "Not everything. She deserves to know how hard we fought to stay standing." Later that evening, she called Chloe into the room, handing her the box. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice calm but filled with emotion, "when I'm gone, promise me you'll open this only when you're ready, not when you're sad, but when you're strong enough to see it all for what it was, a love story that almost broke, but didn't." Chloe tried to protest, tears welling up, but Emma simply pressed a finger to her lips. "Promise me." "I promise, Mom," Chloe whispered, hugging her tightly. As the days passed, Emma's energy faded further, but she never complained. She and David spent long evenings reminiscing about their first date, their struggles, their years of silence, and how they had somehow found their way back to one another. "You know," she said one night, her voice barely above a whisper, "I used to pray that one day you'd understand what love really means." He smiled through tears. "And did I?" She reached out, touching his cheek gently. "More than I ever dreamed." That night, he stayed awake long after she'd fallen asleep, watching her chest rise and fall, memorizing every breath as if afraid to blink and miss one. When dawn came, soft and pink, Emma opened her eyes and whispered, "It's beautiful, isn't it?" David nodded, his throat tight. "It is." She smiled faintly. "Don't be sad when I go, David. Promise me that." His voice broke as he said, "How could I not be?" She looked at him lovingly. "Because sadness means I mattered, and that's enough." The next morning was quiet, the air warm, the daisies outside swaying in the breeze. Emma passed peacefully in her sleep, her face calm, her hand resting lightly on her heart. When David found her, he didn't cry at first. He just sat beside her, holding her hand, whispering, "Thank you, my love, for everything." Chloe arrived moments later, and when she saw her mother, she fell into David's arms, both of them trembling, but held together by the love Emma had spent a lifetime teaching them. The funeral was small, intimate, filled with family, neighbors, and women whose lives she had touched. Her art, her story, surrounded the room in framed color. On one painting, titled "The Woman Who Stayed," a small note rested beneath it in Emma's handwriting: "Forgive, not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Months later, Chloe finally opened the wooden box. Inside, she found the letters, one for every year of her childhood, and one addressed to David. His said simply, "You gave me the ending I always dreamed of, a life where love wasn't perfect, but real." Chloe's letter said, "You were my reason to keep going. Every dream you chase now is part of me living on." Tucked beneath the letters was Emma's last unfinished painting, a field of daisies beneath a glowing sky, a single empty chair facing the horizon. Chloe framed it and placed it in the studio, right beside the window where her mother used to paint. David often sat there quietly, sometimes reading Emma's old journals, sometimes just looking out at the garden. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, Chloe joined him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I miss her every day," she whispered. David smiled faintly, his eyes moist. "So do I. But I see her in the daisies, in the light, in you." Years passed. Chloe married Ethan, and they had a little girl with Emma's eyes. They named her Grace. Every spring, the family gathered in that same garden, planting daisies and telling stories about the woman who taught them all what love truly meant. One day, as Grace helped her grandfather water the flowers, she looked up and asked, "Grandpa, did Grandma paint the sky too?" David smiled, his voice warm and gentle. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, looking toward the heavens. "I think she did." The wind stirred softly through the garden, and for just a moment, it felt like Emma was there, her laughter, her strength, her peace, woven forever into the world she had loved so deeply. And though her story had ended, her legacy lived quietly in every heart she had touched, proof that even the most painful beginnings can bloom into the most beautiful endings.